We're going to be continuing the chemistry of life notes in this video. We're starting on page 2 unless you changed how things were paged out in your notes. We're at define an ion. So earlier I had told you that the atomic number means the number of protons always, and then usually the number of electrons. Ions are the example of when the number of protons and the number of electrons do not equal each other. Now, we also talked about the octet rule a little bit in the last chapter or video. The octet rule essentially states that if an atom has a full valence shell, it's going to be stable or unreactive. So I also mentioned that atoms can do whatever it takes to get to the octet that it really wants to have. It can give away electrons, it can steal electrons, it can share electrons. That's what's setting up what we're going to be discussing here in this video. So to start out, the ion again has an unequal number of protons and electrons. So maybe it has 6 protons but 5 electrons. Because there's an unequal balance of positives and negatives, an ion ends up being an electrically charged atom. And I usually talk about them specifically as ions, and so just kind of get used to that word. Now, depending on what the atom does, it can end up becoming a positive ion or a negative ion. And so I'm going to give you an example first of a positive ion, which is called a cation. I am going to use the simplest possible atom as we talk about that. It's hydrogen. So hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, a mass number of 1. That means it has 1 positive proton inside the nucleus, no neutrons. Ordinarily, it has 1 electron circling out in its nice little orbital. Well, 1 electron does not satisfy the octet rule. You need to remember that this orbital can hold 2 electrons, and so it's not full. Not full means reactive. It's going to do whatever it takes to try to get to a full valence shell. Now, the way hydrogen likes to play this game is the lazy way out. Instead of trying to steal an electron from somebody else, it just throws this one away and kicks it out to whoever happens to be nearby that can accept that electron. What that means is it ends up becoming just 1 positive proton, and that's it. There's no electron. When you have more protons, which are positive, than electrons, that ends up making it a positive ion. Everything in group 1 tends to play the game this way. So sodium likes to become a positive ion. Lithium likes to become a positive ion. So everything in that group 1A that we talked about a little bit last time, this is how it tries to get to that full valence shell. Full, in this case, does mean empty, which can be very confusing, but that's the way it goes. As long as it doesn't have an orbital that's partially full, then it's a happy little element. And since now it doesn't have any orbitals, it doesn't have any that are partially full, and so that makes it nice and complete. Now, to give you a different example, and one that is usually used to talk about cations, let's talk a little bit about sodium. Sodium ordinarily has 11 protons and 11 electrons, which means it has 2 electrons in the first ring, 8 electrons in the next one, and then ordinarily 1 in that outside ring. The easiest way for it to get to an octet is to once again lose this electron and the whole orbital that it had been filling. So now it still has 11 positive protons, but now it only has 10 negative electrons. Whichever subatomic particle you end up with more of, that's the charge you're going to have. So we have 11 positive protons versus just 10 electrons, so sodium ends up being a positive charge. Anything that loses an electron is losing negative, which means it's becoming positive, and so that would make it a cation or a positive ion. On the flip side, negative ions are electrons, are atoms that are going to pick up extra electrons. So we'll talk about fluorine this time. Fluorine has an atomic number of 9, which means it usually has 9 positive protons inside the nucleus. It gets 2 electrons in the next ring out, and then ordinarily it has 7 in the next ring out. Once again, that's not happy. It wants to have the octet, which is 8. So fluorine also has this crazy high what's known as electronegativity. Electronegativity is the ability of an atom to pull electrons from somebody else. Fluorine happens to have the highest electronegativity of any element on the periodic table. What that means is if fluorine gets near any other atom, it's going to try to steal electrons from that. So if it runs into a sodium or a hydrogen or whatever, it's going to steal an electron from that, pick up another one, and then become 8 electrons in that valence shell. Well, now we have 9 positive protons, but 10 negative electrons. So we got more electrons, that gives us a negative charge, and so that becomes a fluoride anion because it has more electrons than protons. Okay. Now, usually I do some practice here, and so I already doodled sodium earlier. You can go back in the video to see that one. I already doodled fluorine, and so you guys can go back to see that one if you want to. I'll go ahead and do the potassium and the chlorine that you can see there on the slide. So potassium, ordinarily, always, has the atomic number of 19. So it has 19 positive protons inside the nucleus. Well, it's going to have 2 electrons there, 8 there, now we're up to 10. Next one can hold 8, now we're up to 18. It's going to have 1 more, so now it's like this. What's the easiest way for this one to satisfy the octet? Give away 1 electron or try to steal 7 from somebody else. It's totally easier to give 1 away. So if it gives that 1 away that's on the outside, it still has 19 positive protons, but now there's only 18 electrons, and so potassium also ends up being a positive ion. Flip side to that, I'm going to change colors. We've got chlorine. Chlorine is the atomic number 17, which means 17 protons, 2 electrons in the first orbital, 8 electrons in the next one, we're up to 10, 7 in the next one. Once again, octet's not satisfied. It's easier to steal 1 than it is to try to give 7 to somebody else, and so it picks up another one to become 8. So now we have 18 electrons, but 17 protons. Electrons are negative, and so chlorine ends up being a negative ion. Once again, if you pay attention to what's on the periodic table, that can help you out. I mentioned earlier, everything in group 1A is going to do a positive ion. Notice potassium, it's in group 1. It became a positive ion. So did sodium, so does hydrogen, so does lithium. All of those tend to do that. Everything that's in group 7A, that's fluorine, chlorine, which we doodled these 2. Notice they become negative ions. Everything in that group has 7 electrons. It's easier to steal 1, and so they tend to become negative ions, just like in that example we did. Alright, so whenever you get 2 different elements that like to form ions that are in the same solution, what will happen is opposites attract. So positive ions, cations, will be attracted to negative ions, anions. That attraction is going to hold them towards each other. That's called an ionic bond. It can only form when you already have ions. It can only form between oppositely charged ions. So again, positive to negative. It's not the strongest type of bond that we have. It's fairly easy to break it, but an ionic bond is going to be important for us. We have a bunch of ionic things like salts that are floating around in our body that are going to help us regulate homeostasis, and so it is pertinent for biology. Now, in the example here, we have a sodium ion, a chlorine ion. If those 2 things were, let's say, mixed together in some water, they would be attracted to each other to make something called sodium chloride. The positive of the sodium cancels out the negative of the chlorine to make it a neutrally charged compound. However, it can, because this is not a super strong bond, it can dissociate in water, and when it does that, because it dissociates back into the ionic forms of sodium and chlorine, it ends up being able to conduct an electrical current. And so sodium chloride is salt. Salts are made out of ionic bonds. Salts are also sometimes called electrolytes because they have that ability to conduct an electrical current. Okay. This is usually the book's picture to show you how all of those electrons are going to be participating. It's even color-coded to kind of show you the sodium actually gave away its electron, in this case to the chlorine, and because we had those opposite charges, they get attracted to each other. Okay. Next type of bond we're going to talk about happens more with elements that are closer to the middle of the periodic table, things that are in like group 4, group 5. Instead of atoms just flat out stealing or giving away electrons, what they will do is they will share electrons between a couple of different atoms. because they're sharing, it very tightly bonds those two atoms for each other. And so covalent bonds happen to be the strongest kind of bond that we're going to talk about. There's different kinds of covalent bonds, but we'll kind of talk about that as we go through them. So we're going to do a couple of examples. This is carbon. If you do the Lewis dot structure of carbon, it has 4 electrons that go around it. Okay? This is the hydrogen that we played with earlier. Now, hydrogen can form an ion, but it doesn't necessarily always. The Lewis dot structure for hydrogen looks like so. There's a molecule called methane. It's CH4. What happens to create CH4 is carbon brings its 4 electrons to the party. Each hydrogen brings its electron to the party. And what you end up with at the end of this is shared pairs of electrons that exist between the carbon and the hydrogen. So because we're sharing electrons all the way around this, each one of those hydrogens is covalently bonded to the carbon because they're sharing those electrons. They don't want to leave it, so they're going to be tightly attracted to each other. We are sharing electrons equally because carbon and hydrogen have similar electronegativity, so the carbon doesn't get to hang out with the electrons any more often than the hydrogens do. When we are sharing equally, like we would between carbon and hydrogen, this creates something called a non-polar covalent bond, which is the strongest type of bond that we're going to talk about here in this class. So non-polar covalent bonds exist between 2 elements that have similar electronegativity when they're sharing electrons between them. Okay, different example. I gotta erase, give me just a second. Whee! Okay, I'm amusing myself entirely too much as I erase stuff. And I can't even erase everything. There's all these stupid little lines and dots that won't go away. Okay, next practice that we are going to do. It's going to be between oxygen, which has a Lewis dot structure that looks something like this, and then 2 hydrogens. So we're making H2O, which hopefully we all know by now, that's water. So oxygen brings its 6 electrons to the party. Each hydrogen brings an electron to the party. So we're still sharing electrons between them. That's still a covalent bond. But oxygen and hydrogen have different electronegativities. In fact, oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than hydrogen is going to have. As a result, it gets to hang out with the electrons a little bit more often than the hydrogens do. We're also going to have a shape feature that comes along with this. So I'm going to draw this in a different way. That water molecule can also be depicted like this, where that line indicates a shared pair of electrons between the oxygen and the hydrogen. This molecule ends up being bent, and because the oxygen has a higher electronegativity, it gets to hang out with the electrons more. That creates this little thing that is called a dipole moment, where the oxygen ends up being a little negative. Now, it's not stealing the electrons, so it's not being an ion, it's just hanging out with them a little bit more often. And so that's what a dipole is. It's sort of like a weak ion. Doesn't get the full-on -1, it just gets a little bit negative. Because the hydrogens don't get to hang out with the electrons as much, both of the hydrogens end up with a positive dipole moment. Now, because we're not sharing equally, the oxygen's hogging the electrons and the hydrogen's not getting to play with them as much, even though we're sharing the electrons, we're not sharing them equally. That creates something called a polar covalent bond, which is still strong. Polar covalent bonds is sort of like the best of both worlds. It has a little bit of a charge like an ionic bond, but it's really strong and it's a covalent bond. That gives any polar molecule certain properties, like they'll be able to dissolve in water, versus polar molecules like that methane can't dissolve in water. So that gets us through what is a covalent bond and how do they form, and it gets us through what's the difference between polar and non-polar bonds. Now, ordinarily when I'm in class, I have my students create a little line graph to help them graph electronegativities. I'm not expecting you to learn every single atom's electronegativity, but what I want you to know is the electronegativity of an atom helps determine what kind of bond it's going to form with other types of atoms. You can Google electronegativity and find periodic tables that include those values on them. And so instead of having students graph it, I'll just say Google electronegativity and print out a periodic table that has that. That'll make your lives a little bit easier. This is kind of what I'm talking about. You can find a graph like this that has electronegativity trends. Generally speaking, here's what it means. If you have two elements that are really close to each other on the periodic table, that means they're going to have pretty similar electronegativity, so they're probably going to form nonpolar bonds between them. But if you have two elements that are really far apart on the periodic table, they're probably going to have pretty different electronegativity, and they're going to start sharing electrons unequally. If you have elements that are crazy far apart, then that means we're not even going to share anymore. One element's going to flat out steal an electron from another one, and we're going to get ionic bonds instead. So that electronegativity, I really can't stress enough how important it is, because it determines what kind of bond is going to form between the different elements. All right. This is usually what I have students graph, but like I said, just Google a periodic table that has electronegativity and you'll be all good. All right. Kind of did that. We talked about covalent bonding. There we go. Hydrogen bonding. What are they and what's unique about them? You can get what it says on the slide, but here's the thing. This is a bunch of water molecules that are depicted for you. And just as a reminder, the hydrogen is held on to the oxygen by a covalent bond. And so there's a covalent bond that exists between those two elements right there. So that creates this water that is a polar covalent molecule. Because of that dipole moment that we talked about that made it polar, if one water molecule bumps up against another water molecule, the negative part of one water will be attracted to the positive part of another one, and you'll get this hydrogen bond that forms between them. It's, again, an attraction of opposite charges. It's way too weak to even be considered an ionic bond. So this is the weakest kind of bond that we're going to talk about. Even though it's super weak, it's again going to be really important for the behavior of different elements, and so it matters. So it can only exist between polar molecules. It exists between the negative part of one polar molecule and the positive part of another polar molecule. The other thing that I do want you to know that I don't have on that slide is that hydrogen bonds help stabilize the shape of big three-dimensional molecules. So it's really important for the shape of DNA and protein. So again, super important even though it's super weak. Next. Here we go. I gave you guys a little table that's in your notes. It says in-class bond summary, and I went ahead and wrote the names of the 4 bonds that we just talked about. Ionic, covalent, which has 2 types, nonpolar covalent and polar covalent, and then hydrogen bonds. This kind of summarizes the rules that I use to figure out what kind of bond is going to form between a couple of different atoms when you look at them. So just pause the video and go ahead and write this stuff down, and that completes the bonding part of the Chemistry of Life notes.